Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this online presentation of our 2022 Fiscal Risks and Sustainability Report. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to take you through the highlights of the report, and we'll then go into an online question and answer session chaired by our Deputy Chief of Staff, Laura Gardner. My slides and speaking notes are now available on our website. If you'd like to ask a question at any point, please use the Q&A feature, and Andy, David, and I will try to answer as many as possible. Please give your name and institution. Let me start by providing some background on this report, and in particular, on why we've chosen to combine the analysis that used to appear separately in our biennial fiscal sustainability reports and fiscal risk reports. 20 years ago, in 2002, the UK Treasury produced the country's first long-term public finance report, the precursor to our long-term fiscal projections. At the time, government debt stood at 28% of GDP. The deficit was about 0.5% of GDP. The economy was growing at an average rate of 2.75%. And inflation was running at 1.3%. The Treasury's pioneering 50-year fiscal projections predicted that government debt this year, 2022, would stay just below 40% of GDP, consistent with the fiscal rules in place at the time. As we now know, debt this year is expected to be more than twice that, at 96% of GDP. So how did we get here, with the government so much more indebted than the Treasury predicted 20 years ago? Part of the answer is that over the past 2 decades, the UK economy has been buffeted by an unprecedented series of global shocks, including a financial crisis, a pandemic, a major war on the European continent, and an energy crisis. And each of these shocks also had major repercussions for fiscal policy, with governments taking on new and sometimes unprecedented roles, including nationalizing and running the country's largest banks, paying the wages of around 1/3 of all employees, and now paying for about 1/2 of the increase in household energy bills. And working away in the background, as this series of crises unfolded, were a set of longer-term pressures on the public finances. The number of people aged 65 and over rose by 3.5 million, from 9.5 to 13 million people. We learned that global temperatures had already risen by 1 degree Celsius and were on track to rise by 4 degrees by the end of the century. And having fallen from over 5% in 2002 to less than 0.5% in 2020, interest rates on government debt are now back up to 2%. So the £1 trillion gap between the under 40% of GDP in government debt, which the Treasury predicted 20 years ago, and the over 90% of GDP in debt, which we ended up with, is a measure of the importance of understanding both the pressures that come from within our economies, as well as the shocks that can hit them from without. And it's only by looking at both pressures and shocks together, and the government's response to them, that we can fully understand the evolution of the public finances over successive generations. So it's for that reason we brought together the long-term fiscal projections that used to appear in our fiscal sustainability reports, with the analysis of the threats to the public finances that used to appear in our fiscal risks reports, into a single annual fiscal risks and sustainability report this year. Let me now turn to the content of this year's FRS. And let me start by thanking the staff of the OBR, Treasury and Whitehall colleagues, and experts from a wide range of fields for their help in putting this report together. However, as always, all judgments and analysis included in this report are our own. The report itself is divided into 3 main chapters. The first looks at the fiscal risks associated with geopolitical tensions, which are rising in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The second looks at the risks associated with higher and more volatile energy prices in the aftermath of that invasion. And the third looks at what changing demographic, economic, and environmental trends mean for the underlying pressures on the public finances over the next 50 years, including taking account of these potential risks along the way. Starting with rising geopolitical tensions, we first look at what the rapidly changing security landscape in Europe and the Pacific could imply for future levels of defense spending. Historically, wars have been the single largest source of fiscal risks in the UK. Indeed, as you can see from the lines on this chart, up until the financial crisis, paying for wars was the only thing that led governments to borrow more than 10% of GDP in a given year over the last 3 centuries. 3 protracted wars on the European continent, the Napoleonic First and Second World Wars, proved particularly expensive, with each adding 90% of GDP to the stock of government debt, which, as a result, reached an all-time high of over 250% of GDP in 1946. Even short of such periods of total war, heightened tensions among major powers have also been expensive, as was the case in the early years of the Cold War, which kept defense spending from falling back to its historical peacetime level of low single digits of GDP. The gradual easing of Cold War tensions over the latter half of the 20th century has been a significant and rare source of fiscal savings to governments in the UK and around the world. The so-called peace dividend reaped by successive chancellors amounted to 8% of GDP as defense spending fell from 10% of GDP at the end of the Korean War in the 1950s to 5.5% prior to the UK's withdrawal from east of Suez during the 1960s, to 4% prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall during the 1980s, to the roughly 2% of GDP where it stands today. And as you can see from the blue area on this chart, this created fiscal space for the expansion of health, education, welfare, and other public spending over the post-war period. A key question hanging over the fiscal outlook in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is what might it imply for future levels of defense spending and the resources available to meet other pressures and priorities. More than 15 other NATO members have already committed to increasing defense spending to meet or exceed the NATO benchmark of 2% of GDP. Germany's commitment to spend an additional 100 billion euros is the most significant in absolute terms and could, if fulfilled, see them overtake the UK as the second largest defense spender in NATO after the US. In the context of what we now know about the Russian threat and commitments from other NATO allies, we consider three scenarios for the path of defense spending in the UK over the next 15 years. At the optimistic end of the spectrum, Russia's failure to secure a swift and decisive victory in Ukraine and recent commitments from our European allies to spend more could, in principle, reduce pressure on the UK and allow defense spending to continue on its post-World War II downward trend to 1% of GDP. This would save the government £27 billion in today's terms, but the UK's commitment to the 2% NATO target would seem to rule this option out of hand. Staying the second largest absolute spender in NATO in light of the German commitment to spend 2% of their larger GDP would require UK defense spending to rise to between 2.5 and 2.8% of our GDP. In our second scenario, UK defense spending rises to 3% of GDP by the mid-2030s, which would comfortably meet this goal, but at a cost of an additional £24 billion in today's terms. The Prime Minister's statement at the NATO summit in Madrid last week that defense spending would reach 2.5% of GDP by 2030 would be consistent with that trajectory. And finally, were the Russian invasion of Ukraine and rising tensions in the Pacific to augur a more seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape, requiring Cold War levels of resource mobilization, then going back to the 4% of GDP spent on defense during the 1980s would cost the UK an additional £49 billion a year. In addition to possible pressures on conventional defense spending, the UK also faces the new and growing threat of unconventional warfare in the form of cyber attacks. The UK was the third most targeted nation for cyber attacks last year after the United States and Ukraine. While most of these incidents have been relatively modest in scale, a few recent attacks have cost other economies billions and governments hundreds of millions. Drawing on a scenario developed by the Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies, we modeled the possible economic and fiscal consequences of a major cyber attack on the UK energy grid. As you can see from the chart on the right, the attack reduces GDP by 1.6% in the year that it happens, and could add up to £29 billion to government borrowing. So while significant, both of these are a fraction of the widespread and long-lasting disruption that we and other countries recently experienced as a result of the pandemic. On top of the potential fiscal costs of these growing security threats, rising geopolitical tensions could also put at risk the gains from global economic integration over the last 70 years. In fact, the pace of global economic integration has already stalled on some measures and reversed on others since the global financial crisis in 2008. As you can see from the chart on the left, having grown rapidly in the early 2000s, global trade as a share of GDP peaked at 31% in 2008 and has fallen to 26% in 2020. And as shown in the chart on the right, global foreign direct investment flows peaked in 2007 at 5% of GDP and have fallen back to 1.4% in 2020. Having historically been one of the most open of the major economies, the fall in both trade intensity and inward FDI has been particularly pronounced in the UK in recent years. And US-China trade wars, post-pandemic efforts to shorten supply chains, and continued uncertainty about our trading relationship with the EU cloud both the global and UK outlook for cross-border trade and investment flows. To estimate the potential economic and fiscal consequences of rising global protectionism, we look at what would happen if simmering trade tensions erupted into an all-out global trade war. This is modeled on a 2019 World Trade Organization scenario in which countries around the world put in place non-tariff barriers equivalent to a 26 percentage point increase in tariff rates. Knock-on effects on global capital movements also raise interest rates on government debt by 1 percentage point. The economic impact of rising protectionism on different countries is proportionate to their degrees of openness and market power, with overall trade volumes falling by 17%. The UK suffers a 22% fall in exports, and its GDP ends up about 5% lower due to the loss of both static and dynamic gains from trade. Reflecting the tendency for both global security and economic tensions to rise in tandem, we conclude the chapter with a geopolitical stress test, which combines rising defense spending, a cyber attack in the mid-2020s, and the trade war I just described. And you can see from the chart on the right that this extreme scenario adds over 3% of GDP to the deficit and over 25% of GDP to debt by the mid-2030s, with the largest contribution coming from the economic fragmentation resulting from greater protectionism. Moving on to the second main chapter of the report, another consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was an increase in energy prices, which had already begun to rise late last year on the back of surging demand following the lifting of lockdown restrictions in advanced economies. Our March forecast assumed that gas prices would rise to £3 per therm and oil to $100 a barrel this year, before falling back some way toward their pre-pandemic levels. Since then, both oil and gas spot prices have remained highly volatile, while futures prices have risen further. And at the time we went to print in late June on this report, markets were expecting gas and oil prices to peak at £3.20 per therm and oil at $110 a barrel, and remain somewhat higher than we forecast over the medium term, as shown in the yellow lines on this chart. To illustrate the economic and fiscal risks associated with high and volatile energy prices, we look at two scenarios for gas and oil prices over the next 5 years. The first is a short, sharp shock, shown in red, in which gas prices more than double to £7 per therm, and oil prices rise to their 21st century high of $147 a barrel, before both fall back to the levels assumed in our March forecast by 2025. The second is a smaller but more persistent shock, shown in blue, in which gas prices stay at £3 per therm, and oil prices rise to and stay at the $147 per barrel for the next 5 years. The temporary spike scenario pushes quarterly inflation into double digits next year, before turning negative as energy prices fall. The resulting contraction in real incomes and consumption is sufficient to tip the economy into recession next year. GDP falls by 4%, below our March forecast in the depths of that recession, and then quickly recovers as prices fall, with no long-term scarring of economic activity. The permanent price shock sees inflation remain above our March forecast for longer, averaging 4% higher in 23-24, and not falling back to target until late 2025. Persistently high energy prices permanently raise economy-wide costs, which reduces the level of GDP by around 2% over the medium term. Turning to their fiscal implications, the temporary price shock adds £30 billion to government borrowing next year, with a persistent effect on welfare spending due to the triple lock on state pensions and the fact that on existing policy settings, other benefits cannot be adjusted downwards in response to deflation. Were the government to extend a level of fiscal support in proportion to that provided for energy bills and the price of oil so far this year, it would add a further £40 billion to borrowing at its peak, as shown in the dotted line and blocks on this chart. The persistent price shock has a smaller peak fiscal impact, with borrowing of £17 billion higher this year. But it has a similar long-term impact, adding £50 billion to debt by the mid-2020s, reflecting the persistent scarring of GDP and non-North Sea tax receipts and higher welfare spending. Were the government to continue to subsidize energy bills in the same proportion as they've done so far this year, this would add a further £100 billion to debt after 5 years. However, in both scenarios, extending government support merely pushes the cost of higher energy prices onto future households, as the government cannot make the costs of more expensive energy go away, but merely adjust who pays for it and when. Looking out over the longer term, the UK has more flexibility to alter where it gets its energy from, both to reduce our dependence on volatile fossil fuels and to meet our ambitions to reach net zero carbon emissions by the middle of the century. So the second half of the chapter looks at the challenge of changing the energy mix of the UK economy, which, despite using 2/3 less energy per unit of GDP than it did at the time of the last energy crisis in the late 1970s, still relies on fossil fuels for 3/4 of its energy. In looking to shift our energy mix away from fossil fuels, the UK faces a trade-off between 3 key objectives. First, affordability, in terms of the cost of building, operating, and decommissioning energy infrastructure. Second, cleanliness, in terms of the volume of carbon emissions generated in the process of producing that energy. And third, security, in terms of the potential for disruption in the supply of that energy as a result of geopolitical, meteorological, or seasonal factors. Measuring the UK's 3 main energy sources against these 3 objectives, fossil fuels used to be relatively cheap, but are also the single largest source of carbon emissions, and have become both more expensive and less secure following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nuclear energy is clean and reliable, but nuclear power plants have proven very expensive to build and even more expensive to decommission. And finally, renewable energy of the kind available in the UK, namely wind and solar, is cheap and clean, but also highly intermittent, depending on the weather, time of day, and time of year. Resolving this dilemma could involve some fiscal costs, especially given the greater focus on energy security alongside net zero prompted by the geopolitical situation. If we were to retain some significant share of fossil fuels in our energy mix, there could be greater pressure on the government to make it consistent with our net zero commitment by subsidizing some of the 16 to 22 billion pound cost of adding carbon capture and storage technology to the next generation of gas-fired power plants. If we're to meet the government's ambition to build an additional 18 gigawatts of nuclear power generation capacity, the government could come under pressure to pick up some of the huge construction costs, with the latest estimates from Hinkley Point C suggest it could be on the order of 170 billion pounds. And finally, solving the intermittency problem of wind and solar energy could see the government coming under pressure to meet some of the up to 20 billion pounds cost of storing energy overnight and between seasons. Meeting these costs has probably also become harder, since we produced our initial estimates of the fiscal implications of getting to net zero a year ago, and for two main reasons. First, higher oil prices are likely to accelerate the transition away from petrol-driven cars, new sales of which are already banned from the 2030s onwards. This will ultimately eliminate the roughly 1.5% of GDP in additional revenue the government currently receives from motoring taxes in the form of fuel and excise duties. Second, while higher gas prices have increased the incentives for firms and households to switch to lower carbon alternatives, in doing so, they reduce the scope for the government to create those incentives itself through extending emissions trading scheme or other carbon taxes. Plugging the latest gas prices into our analysis in last year's fiscal risks report reduces the total potential carbon tax yield by around a sixth, or just under 3% of GDP over the course of the transition. Instead, those revenues are going to current producers of fossil fuels, be they friend or foe. In conclusion, while governments have more options for reducing the UK's energy dependence on fossil fuels over the longer term, each of those options comes with a potential fiscal price tag, and the scope for meeting those costs through higher revenue is diminishing as fuel prices rise and fuel use falls. These emergent geopolitical and energy risks, and all those analyzed in our previous risk reports, need to be managed in the context of a set of longer-term demographic, environmental, and structural pressures on the public finances. And so the third and final chapter of the report provides an updated set of 50-year projections for the public finances out to the early 2070s. This is our first full update to these long-term projections since 2018. These new projections take account of the following significant changes in the interim. First, a more favorable starting primary balance, thanks in part to the tax increases introduced by the previous Chancellor in the wake of the pandemic. Second, updated demographic assumptions based on the interim population projections that were published by the ONS in January. Third, the loss of motoring taxes I described earlier as petrol-driven cars are phased out. Fourth, other economic impacts, including the offsetting effects of the government's significant increase in public investment and the cost of getting to net zero on the long-run level of productivity. And finally, other policy changes, including the additional costs from the government's adult social care reforms and modest savings from reforming the student loan system. Looking in more detail at the demographic assumptions, our projections incorporate the following three changes relative to our 2018 fiscal sustainability report. First, a lower birth rate, which has been revised down from 1.84 to 1.59, reflecting a drop in births that largely predates the pandemic. As you can see from the chart on the left, this contributes to a material downward revision in the young age dependency ratio from 30 to 25%. Second, lower net migration, consistent with the new post-Brexit migration regime, which contributes to a reduction in the average net inflows from 165,000 to 129,000 per year. And third, slower improvements in life expectancy, with the average life expectancy for a woman born in the mid-2040s revised down from 95.6 to 96.2 years. As you can see from the chart on the right, taken together, these changes slightly reduce the old age dependency ratio until the mid-2040s. But after that, the effect of fewer births and lower net migration on the working age population increases the ratio from 30% today to over 50% by the early 2070s. Taken together, these changes reduce the average growth in the overall population from 0.3% in our 2018 FSR to minus 0.1% in our latest projections. As you can see from the chart on the left, this is the first time our projections have been based on a declining population, which rises from 67.1 million in 2020, peaks at 68.4 million in 2044, before falling back to 65.9 million in 2072. But what matters more for fiscal sustainability is not the size, but the age structure of that population. As you can see from the chart on the right, as a result of the demographic trends I mentioned earlier, the share of those under the age of 15 shrinks from 19 to 14% between 2022 and 2072, while the share aged 65 and over rises from 19 to 29% over that period. This chart summarizes what these various changes imply for the evolution of tax and primary spending over the next 50 years. As you can see, receipts decline slightly as a share of GDP, due almost entirely to the loss of motoring taxes as the vehicle fleet electrifies. The falling birth rate reduces spending on education by just under 1% of GDP, a very large proportionate decline. And the overall aging of the population, combined with significant non-demographic cost pressures, pushes up spending on health by 7%, adult social care by 1%, and pensions by 3% of GDP. Looking at what that implies for the path of the fiscal balance, a more favorable starting point, coupled with lower spending on education and welfare in the near term, sees the primary deficit fall below our 2018 projections until the mid-2050s. But the steady aging of the population creates a growing gap between receipts and primary spending thereafter, which rises to 11% of GDP by the end of the projection period. As you can see from the breakdown on the right, this is 2.6% of GDP worse than the 50-year point in our 2018 projections due to the effect of three main things. First, a slightly better starting point, which takes 0.7% of GDP off the deficit. Second, the combination of lower birth rates, lower migration, and higher mortality, which add 1.1% of GDP to the deficit. And third, the loss of motoring taxes, which add another 1.6% of GDP to the deficit. The lower path for primary spending in the near term sees debt fall to 70% of GDP by the mid-2040s. But after that, the growing primary deficit and rising interest burden put debt onto an exponentially rising path, which reaches 267% of GDP by the early 2070s. Of course, coming back to the point I made at the start of this presentation, our baseline projection for debt assumes that nothing else goes wrong for the next 50 years. But if the past 2 decades has taught us anything, it's that things can and will go wrong, and that when they do, they can have significant and lasting effects on the public finances. So this final chart overlays several potential shocks to public debt along the way to the 2070s. Factoring in a stylized estimate of the average fiscal cost of recessions, which occur roughly once a decade and add roughly 10% of GDP to the stock of government liabilities, would push debt above 320% of GDP by the end of the projection period, as shown in the dotted green line. Factoring in the 2 energy price shock scenarios raises the final debt stock to around 300% of GDP. And the geopolitical stress test, combining higher defense spending, a one-off but major cyber attack, higher global interest rates, and a permanent rise in global protectionism, pushes debt above 400% of GDP, due primarily to the impact of rising trade barriers on UK productivity. In conclusion, this analysis of the risks and pressures on the public finances is based on a series of what-ifs. Some are very likely to come to pass. The aging of the population is pretty certain. The need to reduce carbon emissions is widely accepted, and the take-up of electric vehicles is accelerating. Some risks are more uncertain. Energy prices could fall back rather than staying high if geopolitical tensions ease, and the process of global economic integration could be revived. And some threats are as yet largely unknown, as COVID was 3 years ago. But the lesson from the 20 years since the UK produced its first long-term public finances report is that all of these risks need to be understood and mitigated if we're to safeguard fiscal sustainability in what appears to be an increasingly risky world. And we hope that this and future reports provide governments with the analysis they need to anticipate some of these risks, and Parliament and the public with the means to hold them to account for their management. And with that, I'll now hand over things to Laura, who'll be chairing the question and answer session.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'll be putting your questions to the Budget Responsibility Committee over the next 20 minutes or so. As a reminder, you can submit those questions using the question and answer feature in Zoom, not forgetting to include your name and institution. So we're going to start with a question drawing on our analysis of fiscal sustainability that Richard's presentation concluded on. This question comes from Tom Rees of the Daily Telegraph, who says, the OBR says that the medium-term fiscal position doesn't look too bad because of tax rises announced recently. We had the new Chancellor offering tax cuts yesterday, and Tory candidate challenges are likely to offer similar promises. Would reversing the tax rises announced put significant pressure on the public finances? I might invite Andy to come in on that first, and Richard perhaps to follow.
Thanks. Yes. So all else equal, of course, cutting taxes reduces revenue and does put pressure on fiscal balances. So just to give you a few numbers that are factored into our latest forecast from March, the then Chancellor had 25 to 28 billion pounds worth of headroom against his fiscal targets. The health and social care levy is expected to raise 19 billion pounds in that year. The corporation tax rise from 19 to 25% raises 17 or so billion pounds. The freezes on income tax thresholds raising more than 10 billion pounds by that year. And even reversing the temporary fuel duty cut that we have in place at the moment raises £3.5 billion next year. So these are large numbers, fiscally large numbers. Of course, all else is never equal when chancellors are making decisions. So it depends how they are financed. And tax cuts can, of course, be financed by spending reductions. But if they are financed by greater borrowing, then yes, it puts more pressure on, and arguably comes with additional risks in an economy that is running with high inflation.
Did you want to add anything to that, Richard?
I think that's right, and I think in addition to the risks to the fiscal outlook, I think it's important to bear in mind that the tax rises announced by the Chancellor in the previous Chancellor in a succession of budgets were to fund a larger post-pandemic state that was investing more, it was spending more on health, it was spending more on adult social care. The tax burden went up by about 3% of GDP, spending went up by about 2% of GDP, and that leaves about 1% of GDP in headroom. But given all the risks that we've highlighted in our report, there are potentially some significant claims on that headroom, and chancellors typically want to meet their fiscal objectives with some kind of margin for error. So that 1% surplus on the current budget, which the chancellor had over the medium term, is both under pressure and something which chancellors have traditionally tried to hang on to get them through more difficult times.
Thank you. We're going to circle back to the analysis of geopolitical tensions in Chapter 2. We have a question asking, why does your scenario assume a massive cyber attack, higher military spending, and a global trade war all at the same time? Is that likely? Richard, I suggest you come in on that one.
Sure. I guess it reflects the fact and a reflection on the fact that in the world of sort of fiscal risk analysis, when it rains, it pours, and that risks and that things tend to go wrong together rather than individually. And we have seen periods in UK and world history where when you have a breakdown in global cooperation in the political sphere, it spills over into the economic sphere. The interwar years were perhaps the most dramatic example, where you didn't just have conflict between major powers, but actually a breakdown in trade, a breakdown in investment flows between the major powers, which didn't fully recover in the interwar years, and then collapsed again in the wake of the Second World War, and then took a very long time to get back to the levels that we saw at the beginning of the 20th century. So it does reflect a tendency for breakdowns in global cooperation in one element of policymaking, namely security, to also lead to breakdowns in global cooperation in the economic sphere. And we've seen some worrying signs of that in recent years. The trade wars between the US and China, which have also implicated the EU and the UK. We've seen a desire for greater onshoring of production chains in the wake of the pandemic, so that one is less reliant on supply chains that extend all the way to Asia and into countries and into other countries which are potentially politically unstable or less aligned to our political philosophy. So all those things point to the fact that you could see both rising security costs the governments need to meet, but also falling economic cooperation between countries and falling global trade and investment.
And Richard, we just had another similar question come through, probing a little bit more on cyber attacks, so I'll put that to you as well now. Christian Shah of the Resolution Foundation asks, in terms of cyber attacks, is a cyber attack on the electricity network the most likely attack, or the likely most costly attack? or were other sector-specific attacks also looked at?
So we don't take a particular view on what kind of attack is most likely, but what we wanted to do was choose a scenario which we think would have the most significant economic effect. And I should stress that all of the risks that we analyze are designed to look at kind of tail risks, for the sort of plausible tail risks for the UK economy. So we chose an attack that the Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies had designed. We chose the one that impacted the energy grid because that would be the one which had the most significant repercussions for the rest of the economy. So cyber attacks, as we've seen on individual companies or even individual parts of government, tend to have more contained and limited effects on the wider economy. They cause big problems for the companies concerned, but it's only when they spread to the rest of the economy through disrupting some kind of infrastructure that can cause a wider disruption to economic activity and put pressures on the public finances. I mean, I should stress that these things have happened before. We've had cases in the recent past of cyber attacks on Ukraine that ended up spreading to global shipping because they were transmitted to the Maersk shipping company's computers and interrupted their logistics for actually transporting goods all around the world. Maersk is one of the biggest shipping companies in the world. They were collateral damage for an attempt from hackers to attack the Ukrainian government, but they're an example of how these kind of attacks can have systemic effects on the global economy, which can disrupt economic activity, not just in one country but around the world.
Thanks, Richard. We're gonna circle back to the long term covered in chapter 4 of our report. We've got a couple of questions here which I'll ask you to take together. Maybe going to Andy first and then David, I suggest. So first from Chris Giles of the Financial Times. You choose to use a very low migration assumption in your projections. How would the outlook look if you used the ONS projections? And another question, anonymous question asking, why did you say that the aging of the population is certain when you have revised your population projections so much from just 4 years ago? Andy, would you like to come in first?
Yeah, so let me take those in order. First, the migration assumption we use is net inward migration of 129,000 a year, which is the same assumption we use in our medium-term forecasts and rests on some analysis we did 2 years ago when the post-Brexit migration regime was brought in. The ONS projection that you refer to that was published earlier this year uses a multi-year average to set its assumption, and that assumption is 205,000 a year, so 76,000 a year difference. There is a chart in the book, chart 418, that shows the projections on both bases. So our assumption leaves debt at 267% in 50 years' time, and using the ONS assumption would be 217%, so a 50% of GDP difference. And that is based on the assumptions that are also made about the age structure of net migration, that it is concentrated among those working age, so it's more beneficial for tax revenues than it is costly in terms of public spending. To turn to the second question, is the aging of the population certain or uncertain? I think the direction of travel is certain. Again, the old age dependency ratio that Richard showed in the slides rises from about 30% to about 50%. So that it will rise, I think, is known with a high degree of certainty. Precisely how much it will rise, and therefore will it get revised between reports, I think that's very uncertain, particularly as we emerge, hopefully, from the pandemic. The projections to date don't really make any strong assumptions about what the pandemic will mean for trends in life expectancy. So there's clearly a lot of uncertainty there.
Do you want to add anything, David, on either migration or aging?
Yes. I think when it comes to aging, there's a simple reason why one can be relatively sure that there will be substantial aging. The number of people in the UK who are going to be over 70 years of age 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now, those people are already alive. And so you can predict reasonably well how many of them are likely to be alive several decades into the future. When it comes to the total population, there's the uncertainty about what happens to the birth rate. And that's been really volatile recently. It's been on a declining trajectory. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about whether it will continue to decline, flatten off, or move back up toward a sort of replacement rate, which would be a bit above 2. Our assumption is that it levels off where it is today, which historically is a really low level. And add to that the uncertainty about migration. So I think there's a big difference between, how many people are going to be 60, 70 years of age in the future and how many people in total there are in the UK.
Thanks very much, David. And I might stick with you for a second because we've got a question on our work on rising energy prices in chapter 3 of the report, which asks, inflation peaks at 11% in your energy price spike scenario, which is what the Bank of England recently said inflation would reach later this year. So why is your scenario not predicting higher inflation?
Well, the scenario where we consider a spike in energy prices is one where that spike comes toward the end of this year and really has its impact on inflation next year, 2023. So it doesn't have an enormous impact on the profile of inflation this year. The Bank of England's profile for inflation shows it reaching close to 11% in their latest forecast toward the end of this year, and then falling back quite significantly during the course of next year. So were we to get the kind of spike we consider in the report, what would happen is that inflation would just stay high next year, in fact, move up a bit and peak during the course of 2023. So it's not so much a difference in the peak rate of inflation, it's more a difference in how long does inflation stay at very high levels, close to or even a bit above 10% or so.
Thanks, David. I think sort of returning to the overall picture presented by our long-term sustainability analysis, we have a question from David Milliken. I might ask Richard and then Andy if they want to comment on this. David Milliken asks, your forecasts show debt falling as a share of GDP for the next 20 years. What, if anything, does the government need to do now to stop the rise in the forecast much later in the projection period? How realistic is it to get action to stop problems 25 years ahead? Richard, would you like to come in?
Sure. I should preface my remarks by saying that it's not for us to provide the government with specific policy proposals, and indeed we're legally prohibited from doing so. But I think to sort of get at where the answer to your question lies, broadly speaking, there are 3 things which determine the long-term fiscal outlook, and there are 3 things which are driving that increase in debt. One is the profile of the population and the ratio of people of working age to people who are either dependent on the state because they're in education, or they're dependent on the state because they have retired and they're collecting a pension, and they're making increasing use of the health service. So there are a set of options around the size of the working age population. So the participation rate of people who are of working age, are all the people that could be working. And the second is the productivity of those people in work. If productivity increases, if people in the working age population are earning more, they can potentially pay more in tax, and that helps to meet the costs of education and the cost of healthcare, pensions, and other age-related services. So there are things you can do with the amount of tax that you generate without any changes in policy from the working age population that you've got. The second category of things that you can do are, how do you get a grip on the longer term pressures from the spending side? So we have, there are 2 reasons why health spending is rising over the longer term. One is the fact that the population is aging, but an equally important thing is that the unit cost of healthcare is rising, and that just reflects long-term trends and the fact that the cost of healthcare the unit cost of healthcare seems to be rising faster than the rate of the economy and faster than the rate of inflation. Making the health service more productive per unit and per person can also help to arrest some of that rise in the long-term cost pressures on the public sector. And then finally, there are options around what you do about the rate of taxation. If you don't manage to tackle either of those other two things, and you want to keep the public finances sustainable, you have to look at how much tax you're generating from the working population and from those people who pay tax. I think one thing that we highlight is the fact that the situation has actually gotten worse since we did our long-term public finance report in 2018, because we are doing a good thing, which is getting rid of petrol-driven cars. That's good for the environment. But from the point of view of the Exchequer, from the point of view of the Treasury, that's losing at 1.5% of GDP in tax revenues, about £30 billion. And that's a permanent hole in the government's tax take over the course of the next 50 years, which doesn't get replaced. Now, the government has said that it is looking at options for replacing the tax revenue lost from the fact that taxes on motoring, fuel duty and vehicle excise duty is disappearing as a result of more and more people driving electric cars. And one has to bear in mind that it's going to be impossible to buy a petrol-driven car after the 2030s by regulation. And the government is looking at options for replacing that revenue. That would help the picture. That would help the picture somewhat, but it's clearly not enough to close an 11% of GDP deficit that you get by the 27.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to invite Andy to see if he wants to add anything, but I'm going to throw another question into the mix, which is relevant on this topic. Another question from Chris Giles at the FT asking, to what extent are tax cuts a sustainable way to improve the UK's long-term finances? Andy, do you want to reflect on either that or the previous question or both?
Yeah. So again, with the proviso that the OBR is not here to give policy advice, but we can talk about the analytical approach we would take to a question like tax cuts and the long-term public finances. Typically, and I think in every case I can think of, when we look at a tax cut, the direct fiscal cost of cutting that tax outweighs the indirect fiscal benefit from any improvement in economic activity that flows from it. So while tax cuts will typically boost growth in some way, in our analysis, they don't do so sufficiently to pay for themselves. So in one sense, tax cuts do not improve the long-term finances. Now, there are, of course, many aspects of the tax system that are directed at improving economic outcomes, some with greater impacts than others. Just reflecting back on the question that Richard answered, I mean, one of the issues for the first half of the long-term projections is that the medium-term fiscal position ends our latest forecast in quite a strong position, and retaining that is key to having debt on a declining path.
Thank you, Andy. So next question, I think I might come to you first, David. A question from Jack Barnett at City AM, who asks, do you think the recent drop in labour force participation will persist? And if it does, how damaging could that be to the public finances and the health of the economy?
I think it's reasonable to assume that some of the drop in labour participation, some of the people who left the labour force likely won't come back. It seems that a significant proportion reflects older workers dropping out of the labour force. Some of that may be health related, some of it may be people just deciding to take early retirement. And it seems sensible to assume that a significant proportion of those people won't come back. Some of it, I think, is due to younger people deciding to stay in higher education, particularly during the sort of the COVID period we've been through, to some extent continuing. I think there it's more likely that might prove to be a transitory factor, but I think on balance, a sensible central assumption would be that there is likely to be some lasting effect of the lower participation we've seen recently. And that will have some negative impact on the aggregate size of the labour force in the UK, almost certainly, and therefore affects a bit one's projections for GDP, something we did take into account at the time of the economic and fiscal outlook report we put out back in the spring. So I think the answer is that it would be sensible to change somewhat one's view about the participation rate looking into the medium term based on what's happened over the last couple of years.
Anything to add, Richard or Andy? Okay, so we've sort of addressed most of your questions now. It's possible that there might be other things people are focused on today, but we do have one final question, which I think is a really good one to close on, actually. So we'll go to that. And that question is, what lessons do you think the new Chancellor should draw from this report? Richard, would you like to take that one?
Sure. I think the main lesson I would draw from this report, and indeed the lesson that I draw from the last 2 years of economic forecasting in which I've been in this role, has been the importance of looking at our central forecasts and our risk reports together, in that our central forecasts represent our best understanding of a snapshot of what we know about the state of the economy and the UK's economic and fiscal prospects. But what we also have all experienced and all lived through over the last 2 years is just how volatile and unpredictable the global environment is for making economic policy and making fiscal policy, and understanding those risks and pressures, both the near-term ones like higher energy prices and the future path of the pandemic, but also looking beyond our 5-year forecast horizon, thinking about these longer-term pressures, things like the cost of aging, things like the potential costs of getting to net zero, also need to be anticipated and taken into account when you're setting fiscal policy with the long term in mind and with sustainability in mind. So I guess I'd really encourage a new Chancellor to look at the full suite of reports that we produce, both our central forecasts as well as these analyses of risks and pressures when setting fiscal policy, and in setting that policy to anticipate and aim off for the fact that we aren't able to analyze and anticipate all the potential risks and shocks that might hit the UK public finances. But this kind of work gives you a sense of the potential scale of those risks and what you might need to do to make sure that you can get ahead of them.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks also to David and Andy for your time today. As Richard has said, while today might feel like an odd day to be focusing on the long-term sustainability of the public finances, much of what we covered in the report published today will be near the top of the Chancellor's in tray. But given there might be other press briefings some of you are looking to tune into shortly, we'll wrap ours up here.